Hey, what is up guys? This is David here from Phone Buff, and in this video, we're going to be taking a look at the evolution of Google's flagship smartphones, otherwise known as their Nexus devices. Now, looking at this collection here, you may be counting 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and you may be thinking, now wait a minute, that fourth box there is for the Galaxy Nexus, and the fifth one is definitely for the Nexus 4, so what's inside that first box? Well, it's not a Nexus, at least not technically. These four here are your actual Nexus devices, or should I say Nexi. So again, what's inside of this box? Well, like we do on the channel every now and then, let's do an unboxing and find out. And the mysterious device inside of the mysterious HTC branded box is none other than the HTC Dream, or more commonly known as the G1. As in the OG numero uno, the smartphone that started it all for Android, so you know I just had to include it in this video. Now, before we get into how these devices evolved over time, I want to let you guys know that if you want to pick up any of these bad boys, which, you know, the older ones are kind of like collector items now, you can find the links right below the like button of this video for pricing and availability. So, in the beginning there was, like I said, the G1, which launched with Android 1.0. When you look at the phone, it isn't something that's necessarily nice to look at by today's standards, and to be honest, it wasn't nice to look at back in late 2008 either. I remember when I was rocking the G1, showing off all the cool things you could do to my iPhone buddies, and they just look at the phone and say, your phone's a brick and it has an ugly chin. And you know what? It was true. I tried to sell them on the idea that the chin was designed to align with your face and that it also protected the screen from scratches when you would lay it flat on the counter, but they didn't really buy into it and just kind of went off with their MMS-less, video capture-less iPhones. While the G1 definitely didn't win any style awards, it did bring with it some features that were much appreciated. It had a physical slide-out keyboard that had a unique hinge that actually held up pretty nicely. The keyboard itself was pretty good, and even had a dedicated row for numbers. The G1 had buttons for both making and ending calls, as well as a menu, home, and back button, which we still see on some Android devices today. Right in between those buttons was a clickable trackball, which meant you were pretty much able to navigate throughout the entire OS without ever having to touch the screen. The TFT touchscreen on the G1 was 3.2 inches diagonally, and it had a resolution of 320 by 480. On the back, there was a 3.2 megapixel camera, a speaker right next to where an LED flash would normally be, and a with Google logo in the center. On the right side of the phone, you had a dedicated camera button. On the left, there was a volume rocker and micro SD card slot. There was nothing up top, and at the bottom you had what was standard back then in a mini USB charging port, which also doubled as the headphone jack so long as you had an adapter. Yeah, not having a built-in headphone jack sucked pretty bad. Under the hood, you'd find a 1150 mAh battery, and just to put that in perspective, that's almost half of what's inside the Nexus 4. The processor the G1 had on board was made by Qualcomm and was just a single core clocked at 528 MHz or 0.5 GHz for those of you who don't remember the days when mobile CPUs were measured in megahertz. The G1 had only 192 megabytes of RAM and had just 256 megabytes of internal memory, which meant you'd run out of space after installing just a couple of apps. So after considering all of these jaw-dropping specs, the next logical question that comes to mind is, what were the dimensions? Well, like my friend said, the thing was a brick with a thickness of 17 millimeters and a weight of 158 grams. But thankfully, just like with the specs, Google improved on this with each and every new Nexus flagship. Which brings us to the Nexus 1, or the first real Nexus smartphone that launched with Android 2.0 Eclair. Though the Nexus 1 was manufactured by HTC just like the G1, you wouldn't think the same company made both phones when looking at them side by side. While the G1 lacked polish and didn't really look like a finished product, the Nexus 1 was arguably one of the best designed smartphones out in early 2010. HTC and Google did away with the slide-out keyboard, making the Nexus 1 33% thinner than the G1 at 11.5mm and 18% lighter at 130 grams. Google also upped the display size from a 3.2-inch TFT to a 3.7-inch AMOLED screen while increasing the resolution to 800 by 480. Physical buttons were replaced by capacitive ones, and the trackball made its second and final appearance on a Google flagship smartphone. Instead of the call end button like on the G1, there was a power button added up top along with a 3.5mm headphone jack. On the bottom, the mini USB charging port was changed to what is now standard in micro USB, and there was also 3 pins at the bottom for docking, but the accessories never really became widely available. Sound familiar? Anyway, with no dedicated camera button, there was nothing on the right side and only a volume rocker on the left. On the back, the with Google logo was changed to just Google, and the camera was upgraded to a 5.0 megapixel shooter with LED flash. Underneath the back cover, there was a 1400 mAh battery, and just like on the G1, there was a slot for a micro SD card and a mini SIM. Powering the Nexus 1 was a Qualcomm Scorpion single-core processor clocked at 1 GHz coupled with 512 MB of RAM, which were actually really exciting specs back in the day. With double the processing power, double the RAM, a better camera, and a bigger screen with higher resolution, it's somewhat needless to say that the Nexus 1 was a huge improvement over Google's previous flagship. But I don't know if I could say the same for its third flagship, the Nexus S made by Samsung, which launched with Android 2.3 Gingerbread. While there were definitely improvements over the Nexus 1, they weren't nearly as drastic, at least not on paper. In fact, to an uneducated eye, a lot of the major specs looked to be just about the same. The processor was still a 1 GHz single core, there was still just 512 MB of RAM, the slightly larger 4-inch Super AMOLED screen's resolution was the same, as was the camera's megapixel count. Now, specs are just specs, and real-world performance did actually favor the Nexus S over the Nexus 1, but again, the difference wasn't that big. Now, that's not to say that the Nexus S was a disappointment. While it didn't improve leaps and bounds over the Nexus 1 in some departments, it did bring with it some things that the G1 and the Nexus 1 didn't even have on its spec sheet. Like what? Well, for one, it had a VGA front-facing camera, which as hard as it is to believe was something new to Android. And maybe even more exciting was the fact that it had NFC capabilities, which automatically made other phones without NFC feel outdated. There were officially no more physical buttons or trackballs on the front, with just 4 capacitive buttons for back, menu, search, and home. Unlike the HTC One though, these buttons were nearly invisible when they weren't illuminated, which really gave the Nexus S that sleek black look that we've now come to associate with Nexus devices. Like the G1, Google decided to make the Nexus S curve to feel more natural when holding it against your face, except this time they got it right and made it look way sexier with the curved glass. No more chin. Well, at least not on the front. At the bottom of the Nexus S, you had your micro USB charging port and 3.5mm headphone jack. On the left, there was a volume rocker, and on the right, you'd find the power button, both of which have remained in the same spots in later generation Nexus smartphones. Underneath the hood was a 1500 mAh battery, a 100 mAh improvement over the Nexus 1, and as you can see, there was no micro SD card slot, which started here with the Nexus S and unfortunately has continued on with later generations. But the good news was that the Nexus S had 16GB of USB storage and 10 times the internal storage, which meant you could pretty much install as many apps as you'd like, something you couldn't really do with the first two Google flagships. Overall, the Nexus S was really a mixed bag. It brought with it many improvements along with a few disappointments, but thankfully, Google and Samsung's next attempt was, at least in my opinion, much better. The Galaxy Nexus was a game changer for Android, launching with the totally redesigned Android 4.0 ice cream sandwich. But the OS wasn't the only thing that was redesigned. The phone itself looked very different from what we were used to seeing with Android phones, at least up until that point. Continuing on with the trend of less and less buttons, whether they're physical or capacitive, the Galaxy Nexus had none. On the front, you just had an earpiece, a 1.3 megapixel front-facing camera, and a huge 4.65-inch display. That's right, I said huge, because back then, a 4.65-inch display was huge, relatively speaking. Google and Samsung stuck with a curved display which had, for the first time on a Nexus, an HD resolution of 1280 by 720, giving you super sharp quality that none of Google's previous flagships could rival. Powering all those pixels was a 1750 mAh battery, a 250 mAh improvement over the Nexus S. Under the hood was a dual-core Texas Instruments OMAP processor clocked at 1.2 GHz, and as if doubling the cores and increasing the clock speed wasn't enough, they doubled the RAM as well, up to 1 GB for improved multitasking. On the right side of the phone, you had your power button and 3 pins for docking, which just like with the Nexus 1, accessories never became widely available for. On the left, there was a volume rocker, and up top, there was nothing, but it's worth mentioning that the phone had a tapered design where the top end was much thinner than the bottom, measuring in at 8.9mm. Speaking of the bottom, it had a 3.5mm headphone jack and a micro USB charging port. On the back was, for the third time, a 5 megapixel camera with LED flash. Of course, just like the Nexus S's 5 megapixel shooter improved over the Nexus 1's, the Galaxy Nexus's camera was the best of the 5 megapixel bunch, delivering better photo quality and 1080p video capture. Out of all the Nexus devices, I think I'd have to say that the Galaxy Nexus was my favorite, mainly because it helped take Android to a whole nother level. What's your favorite Nexus? Let us know down in the comments below. But maybe before you do that, let's take a look at Google's latest flagship smartphone, and the last one we'll be covering in this video, the Nexus 4. The Nexus 4 was manufactured by LG and launched with Android Jelly Bean 4.2. When the Nexus 4 debuted, it was undeniably the best smartphone in the world, at least dollar for dollar. It had a beautiful non-curved 4.7-inch HD IPS display with a 1280 by 768 resolution, and it continued that sleek back look that was introduced with the Nexus S with nothing but an earpiece and a 1.3 megapixel camera on the Gorilla Glass covered front. On the back, for the first time on a Nexus smartphone, there was no removable back cover. Instead, you were met with a Gorilla Glass dotted glitter pattern that's only really visible when holding the phone at an angle in the light. The Google logo that had appeared on all previous flagships was changed to Nexus, indicating that Google wanted the Nexus lineup to be looked at as more of its own brand. Also on the back, for the first time since the Nexus 1, Google upped the megapixel count on the camera to 8 megapixels with an LED flash. Under the hood, there were several significant improvements. For one, the amount of cores in the processor was doubled once again to a quad-core Snapdragon S4 Pro clocked at 1.5 GHz. Following suit, the RAM was also doubled to a whopping 2 GB. To help power the larger screen and the more powerful hardware, Google and LG were able to fit in a 2100 mAh battery, an improvement of 350 over the Galaxy Nexus, all while keeping the phone relatively thin at 9.1mm. The power button and volume rocker appeared in the same spots as it did on the Galaxy Nexus, but this time on the left side, due to not having a removable back cover, there was also a slot for a micro SIM card, meaning that if you're coming from the Galaxy Nexus, you'd need to change your mini SIM as the card would no longer fit. For the first time since the Nexus 1, the 3.5mm headphone jack was moved back up top, and like all the flagship Google smartphones before it, the charging port could be found at the bottom of the Nexus 4. With everything I just mentioned about the Nexus 4, it was already a big step up from the Galaxy Nexus, but Google and LG had one final trick up their sleeves with the introduction of Qi wireless charging. Sure, the compatible accessory took over 4 months to come to market, but having the ability to charge your smartphone without having to plug it in every time you wanted to do it just may have been worth the wait. Okay, so while the Nexus 4 was definitely a big step up from the Galaxy Nexus, it was an incredibly, amazingly huge, ginormous step up from where Google started just a few short years ago with the G1. With 1.5 times the screen size, 6 times the resolution, 4 times the cores, 3 times the clock speed, 10 times the RAM, double the battery, and 2.5 times the camera, with the addition of NFC, Qi wireless charging, a front-facing camera, and a whole bunch of other things that I probably forgot to mention, it's crazy to think how much these phones have evolved over time. And it only makes you wonder what Google and its partners have in store for the next Nexus smartphones. Alright guys, that is pretty much it for me in this video. If you liked it, please give it a thumbs up, share it with your friends, and follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Google Plus for more great mobile technology content just like this. Thank you for watching.